The house was silent, save for the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a relic from another era, much like Edward himself. It was nearly midnight, and the shadows stretched long across the faded walls of his modest room at the back of the house. He sat alone in a worn armchair, a cup of untouched chamomile tea cooling on the side table, its steam long gone. His legs ached, his back too, but it was nothing compared to the heaviness in his chest that had taken root in recent months. His phone buzzed. Edward squinted down at the screen. Liam, his grandson, had sent a video. That was unusual. Liam didn't message often. At 17, he was usually too busy with school, sports, and the digital blur of youth Edward barely understood anymore. Yet, despite the generational distance, Liam had always shown him a flicker of warmth, of patience, even when the rest of the household grew colder by the day. Curious, Edward tapped the notification. The screen lit up with a blurry image, Helen's living room. His daughter stood in the center, barefoot, her arms flailing as she spoke animatedly to someone off camera. He just sits there like a statue. A worthless burden, that's what he is. We feed him, house him, and for what? Because he paid a few bills 20 years ago? Please. The sound was crisp, unmistakable. Edward froze, his mouth parted slightly, but no words came. The room felt smaller somehow, like the air itself had recoiled in shame. Helen laughed, as though she were recounting a joke, not dismantling the man who'd raised her. Edward couldn't see who she was talking to, but the way her voice dipped, conspiratorial and cruel, told him she meant every word. He doesn't even realize the house is in our name now. He thinks he's some silent saint, paying off a mortgage like it makes him irreplaceable. Honestly, I can't wait until he's gone. I'm done pretending. The video ended. Edward sat there, staring at the black screen, its glow gone. Silence rushed in again, but it was different now, thick and suffocating. The betrayal was so stark, so personal, that it didn't sting immediately. It paralyzed. A lifetime of love, protection, sacrifice, all reduced to mockery. And from Helen, of all people, he didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, he felt an odd clarity begin to creep into his bones. Not rage, not heartbreak, something steadier, sharper. He rose from his chair slowly, as if his limbs knew they were standing for a different man now. A man who saw clearly. A man waking up from a long, painful sleep. He walked to the dresser and pulled open the bottom drawer. Beneath old handkerchiefs and photo albums, he retrieved a faded folder labeled House Mortgage /Loan. He hadn't looked at it in years. Inside were stacks of yellowed bank statements, receipts, legal forms. Page after page of evidence that it had been him, always him, keeping this roof over all their heads. The mortgage payments made under his name. The refinancing he'd done quietly when Helen had been unemployed. The years he'd gone without so much as a vacation, choosing instead to funnel every extra cent into keeping her and her family safe, stable, secure. Worthless burden. The words ricocheted in his mind, growing louder, sharper, uglier. He thought back to the early years. Helen's tearful calls after her divorce, her voice cracking as she begged him to move in. Just until we're back on our feet, Dad. And how he, widowed and lonely, had jumped at the chance to be needed again. To feel useful. To be close to family. He never asked for gratitude. Just respect. A place at the table. Instead, he'd been exiled to the shadows. Tolerated, but no longer seen. Until now. His phone buzzed again. A second message from Liam. I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to show you. I thought you deserved to know the truth. Edward stared at the message. Then, for the first time in months, he smiled. Small, bitter, but real. Liam had lit a match in the darkness. And Edward? He was done sitting in the cold. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Sleep didn't come that night. Edward sat in the dark, the video echoing in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. It wasn't just Helen's words that kept him awake. It was what they represented. The quiet unraveling of a narrative he had clung to for years. The illusion that, despite everything, he had a place in this family. By morning, he didn't recognize the man who looked back at him in the mirror. His shoulders seemed heavier. His eyes, normally kind and distant, were sharp now, hollowed by realization. As the house stirred to life, he remained silent. He ate his breakfast alone, as usual at the far end of the kitchen table. Helen's voice drifted in from the hallway, bright and casual, as if the night before had never happened. It was a cruel contrast to the storm churning inside him. The past clung to Edward like dust. He remembered the day Helen called him, panicked and weeping. It had been 10 years since her husband Robert's business collapsed and left them drowning in debt. She sounded so small on the phone, a far cry from the confident, sharp-witted daughter he'd raised. "We need you, Dad. I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice." She didn't have to ask twice. Edward sold off the last of his retirement bonds and packed up his life in less than a week. Left behind the small apartment he shared with his late wife, June, a place still thick with her scent, her presence, her voice. But what did it matter? June was gone, and Helen, his only child, needed him. That was enough. At first, things had felt almost joyful. Liam was younger then, and he used to sneak into Edward's room to listen to bedtime stories. Helen had thanked him with teary hugs. Robert had promised to repay every cent once they got back on their feet. It felt like family again, broken but salvageable. And so Edward paid, month after month. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, sometimes even private tutors when Liam struggled in school. He made excuses when Helen's tone turned short, or when Robert grew distant. He convinced himself that sacrifices were part of love, part of being a father. But the sacrifices came with a quiet toll. He had let his own life dwindle into background noise. He no longer had friends over. He didn't travel. He gave up on the idea of a peaceful retirement, watching the world pass from the corner of a crowded home he helped sustain. There were moments, of course, fleeting seconds, where he wondered if they still saw him as a person. Not a checkbook, not an obligation, but every time that doubt surfaced, he buried it under guilt. "They've just been through so much, Edward. Be patient. Families recover." Now those memories stung, especially as Helen laughed in the video, mocking him with the kind of venom she once reserved for those who had hurt her. That afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table and pulled out one of his oldest photo albums. There, he found the image of Helen as a child, about 7 years old, standing in the garden with June, laughing with her arms thrown around a sunflower taller than she was. Edward stared at it for a long time, almost daring the memory to speak. "Where did she go?" he whispered to no one. "What happened to the girl who used to fall asleep in my arms after scraping her knee?" Maybe that girl had never existed. Maybe he'd only seen what he wanted to. The kettle whistled. He didn't move to silence it. He thought of the nights he'd gone without proper meals to make sure Liam had everything he needed. Of the birthdays they forgot. Of the slow exclusion from family decisions. And now, of course, the final blow. Being labeled a burden in the house he had built, financially and emotionally, from the ground up. For the first time in his life, Edward wondered if love, in its purest form, could be a trap. A loyalty so blind it became a prison. But now, the fog had lifted. The truth was painful, yes, but also freeing. The price of loyalty had been steep. His pride, his peace, his identity, but what they didn't know, what Helen would soon learn, is that Edward still had more to give. Just not in the way she expected. He was done being silent. He wasn't going to demand their love. He wasn't even going to beg for their respect. No. He was going to take back something far more valuable. The next morning, Edward found Liam in the garage, fiddling with an old bike frame. The space smelled of rust and motor oil, and sunlight filtered in through slats in the door, slicing the air into gold and shadow. Liam looked up when he heard his grandfather's slow footsteps. "You saw it?" he asked softly, guilt already brimming in his eyes. Edward nodded but said nothing. He didn't trust his voice yet. Liam stood, wiping grease from his fingers with a rag. I wasn't trying to spy. I swear. Edward waved off the apology, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to send it, he said quietly. But you did. Liam's shoulders sagged in relief and shame. I thought you should know. You deserve to. He hesitated, as if there were more to say. Edward waited. I was testing out a new security feature on my phone, Liam explained, nervous now, like he feared judgment. It connects to the smart speakers in the living room, records clips if it picks up loud voices or movement. I didn't even realize it caught that until I was deleting files. Edward frowned. So that wasn't even meant to be recorded? Liam shook his head, jaw tightening. It wasn't supposed to happen at all. They stood in silence for a beat. Outside, a bird chirped, cheerful and oblivious. Edward stared at his grandson, suddenly seeing not the awkward teenager glued to his devices, but a young man on the verge of waking up to the dysfunction around him. You've always been kind to me, Edward said, voice rough. Even when your parents weren't. I didn't see it before, Liam admitted, but now I can't unsee it. The way Mom talks about you when you're not in the room. The way she takes and pretends she's owed everything. There was bitterness in Liam's voice that didn't belong to a boy. It belonged to someone learning too early what family really meant, and didn't mean. I think she resents you, Liam added, quieter now. Because you've always made things better. You've always been the one holding everything together, even when she was falling apart. Maybe she hates needing you. Edward's brow furrowed. He didn't like thinking of his daughter in such cruel terms, but the truth, once glimpsed, couldn't be unseen. He let out a long breath, the weight of it sagging his shoulders. She used to be so bright, Edward said softly. So full of laughter. Your grandmother loved her fiercely. I did too. But somewhere along the way, that little girl disappeared. Liam looked down, guilt tightening his jaw. What does that make me? He asked. The son of someone like that? Edward stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Liam's shoulder. That makes you someone who sees the truth and still chooses to do what's right. That takes more courage than you know. Liam's eyes flickered, vulnerable. He nodded, swallowing the emotion thick in his throat. But you have to be careful now, Edward said, his tone shifting. If your mother finds out you sent me that video, she'll turn on you too. I've seen how she reacts when she feels exposed. I've already noticed, Liam muttered. She's been more controlling lately. Asking about my texts, checking my browser history like I'm 10. Edward's eyes narrowed. That's not just control, that's fear. She's afraid of losing something. But what? She already has everything. This house. My dad does whatever she says. You've been the one keeping it all afloat. Edward didn't answer. He had begun wondering the same. Liam folded his arms, frustrated. You think maybe this house is more than what it looks like? Edward gave him a long, contemplative look. Maybe, he said, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. First things first. We protect each other. Liam nodded, his voice low but certain. We're in this together. Edward turned to leave the garage, but just before he stepped out into the light, he paused. You did the right thing, Liam. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Liam said nothing, but the look in his eyes said everything. He was scared. But he was also ready to stand beside the only person who had never lied to him, the only person who had never asked for anything, yet had given everything. And somewhere, deep in Edward's chest, something stirred again. Not anger, not grief, resolve. Edward hadn't been down in the basement for years. The door groaned on its hinges as he opened it, releasing a wave of musty air, old wood, dust, and something else, memory. The steps creaked beneath his weight as he descended, one slow footfall at a time, each groan of the staircase echoing like an accusation. The basement was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, casting flickering shadows over cobwebbed corners. Shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten boxes, holiday decorations, old textbooks, a cracked fish tank, unopened mail from over a decade ago. Time had gathered here and waited. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly, just that something inside him needed to see the past written down. To confirm that his sacrifices hadn't been imagined, that the mortgage payments, the groceries, the utilities, those weren't just favors done out of love. They were lifelines he provided, while others looked away. He moved toward the far corner, where a battered gray filing cabinet stood beneath an old sheet. It had once belonged to Robert, who'd used it during the early years of his real estate ventures, before his career crumbled, and Edward quietly stepped in to fill the financial void. Edward pulled the sheet back and coughed as a small cloud of dust billowed up. The metal drawer stuck at first, but with a grunt he yanked it open. Inside were manila folders, dog-eared and faded with age. Most were filled with property tax receipts, renovation quotes, and old appliance manuals. Nothing meaningful until he reached the bottom drawer. There, nestled beneath a stack of neglected insurance forms, was a thick black ledger. His name was etched in faded silver ink on the spine. E. Mallory. House expenses. His fingers trembled as he opened it. Each page was a testament, row after row of dates, amounts, and scribbled notes, carefully recorded in his neat handwriting. The first entry was dated nearly 11 years ago, January 3rd. Paid mortgage installment minus $2,150. Helen 1 month behind. February 1st. Grocery run minus $437. March 15th. Covered emergency plumbing repair minus $870. Robert promised to reimburse. Page after page, month after month, year after year. He flipped further. There were no reimbursements, no repayments, no acknowledgments. Just Edward, quietly, consistently, keeping the house afloat. As he read, Edward felt a strange mix of grief and pride wash over him. It was all here. Proof that he hadn't imagined it. That his life had not been a passive shadow beside Helen's. He had built this life with his own hands. He had earned every right to call this house home. And then, as he neared the final pages, something made him pause. Tucked into the back cover was a yellowed manila envelope, sealed and brittle with time, written in bold pen across the front, property deed, updated ownership, 2013. Edward frowned. His fingers worked gently to open it without tearing the fragile paper. Inside was a folded document, official in tone and format, stamped by the county registrar's office. His eyes scanned the page, then stopped. Title holders, Edward Mallory, and underneath that, another name. Co-owner, redacted for suspense, see Chapter 7. He stared at it, stunned. The name wasn't Helen's. It wasn't Robert's. It wasn't even Liam's. He reached for a chair and sat down slowly. This changed everything. Edward leaned back, the paper trembling in his hands. The implications rattled him. Years of being treated like a guest in the home he legally co-owned. Perhaps even solely owned. Had they known? Had Helen deliberately kept this from him? Or worse, from someone else? He flipped the page over, hoping for answers, but instead found an attached receipt, a notarized fee for a property title update filed by his late wife, June. Filed 2 months before she passed away. His throat tightened. He hadn't known she'd gone to the trouble of updating anything. She'd been quiet near the end, battling illness with stubborn grace. She'd asked him to stay close to Helen after she was gone. He'd interpreted that as a plea for familial unity. Now he wondered if it had been a warning. He tucked the deed and the ledger under his arm and turned off the basement light. By the time he climbed the stairs, the house above felt different, less like a shared space, and more like a place stolen from him, piece by piece, behind a curtain of familial performance. For the first time in years, Edward wasn't questioning his worth. Now he was questioning theirs. It was Liam who found the loose board. He hadn't meant to. He was just following his instincts, now sharpened by the slow unraveling of his family's truth. Ever since he and Edward had examined the deed in the basement, something in him had shifted. He felt like he was walking through a house made of half-truths and hidden corners. That Sunday morning, the rain pattered quietly against the roof while Helen and Robert were out at a charity brunch, performing the kind of flawless family routine that masked what festered beneath. Edward was in the garden, trimming back a dying rose bush, lost in quiet thought. And Liam? He'd returned to the attic room to find an old family photo album he vaguely remembered. Instead, he found the creek. He stepped on it twice, to be sure. The board near the far wall, beneath a dusty trunk and a pile of old coats, didn't groan. It gave a soft, shifting looseness, like something that wasn't meant to be stepped on too often. He looked around, heartbeat quickening. No voices downstairs, no footsteps, no distractions. Using a screwdriver from his pocket, something he often carried while tinkering with gadgets, Liam gently wedged it under the floorboard and lifted. The wood came up with a dry sigh, revealing a shallow cavity filled with dust and tightly bundled papers. At first, he thought it was just junk, forgotten tax files maybe, or decades-old bills. But then he saw the leather-bound pouch, worn, cracked along the edges and tied with a thin black ribbon. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed envelopes with postmarks dating back to the early 1980s, each addressed in the same graceful handwriting, June Mallory. His grandmother. Liam's fingers trembled as he opened the first letter. June, I know I said I wouldn't write again, but the silence is killing me. I saw you last week, just for a moment, near the flower shop on Oak Street. I wanted to speak, but I knew I shouldn't. You looked happy, settled, but I need to know, was she mine? Was Helen ever really ours? He froze. That single line detonated in his chest. Was Helen ever really ours? Liam rifled through the letters, each more desperate and conflicted than the last. The same man's name appeared again and again at the bottom. Martin. Some letters were returned unopened. Others bled with longing and regret. And then, one final envelope, larger and heavier than the rest. Tucked inside was a signed adoption document. Helen Mallory, adopted on June 14, 1984. Liam staggered back, clutching the paper like it burned. She was adopted. His mother, the woman who had tried so hard to control every corner of the family, was not Edward's biological daughter. Not even June's, entirely. The letter mentioned an affair, a child left behind, and a rushed adoption to preserve the family's name. He sat still for a moment, everything inside him swirling. He thought of the video, the cruel words, the manipulation, the entitlement Helen wielded like a weapon. Had it all come from a place of insecurity, of not belonging? He descended the attic stairs slowly, the pouch of letters held tightly in his hands. Edward was sitting at the kitchen table, his glasses low on his nose, a notebook open in front of him. He looked up when Liam entered and stopped when he saw the expression on his grandson's face. "What did you find?" he asked, voice low. Liam placed the pouch on the table and sat down opposite. "I found everything," he whispered. "Letters from a man named Martin. To Grandma, June, and this." He slid the adoption papers across. Edward stared at them, reading in silence. The seconds stretched, heavy and sharp. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes, but not of shock, not even sadness, of recognition. "I always wondered," Edward murmured. June had moments, quiet ones, when she looked like she was carrying something she could never tell me. I never asked. I thought, if it mattered, she'd say it. "And now?" Liam asked. Edward closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. "Now I realize she tried to protect everyone, even at the cost of the truth." They sat there, grandfather and grandson, in a house that suddenly felt stranger than ever. The floor beneath them creaked. The walls seemed to lean in. The very foundation of their family, once seemingly built on shared love and sacrifice, was now cracked open, revealing a secret buried for decades. And in that silence, one thing became clear. Helen had been fighting for something that was never truly hers to claim. Edward had always thought Robert was simply passive. A quiet, mild-mannered man with thinning hair and a bland smile, Robert had mastered the art of blending into the background of family life. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't warm. He simply was. A fixture at the dinner table, a shadow beside Helen at holiday parties, someone who nodded more than he spoke. But Edward had never trusted stillness. He'd lived long enough to know that silence could be as dangerous as words. That suspicion began to sharpen after the discovery in the attic. The adoption. The letters. The hidden truth about Helen's origins. And now, with every passing day, Edward noticed things he hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to see. The hushed conversations between Helen and Robert that stopped when Edward entered the room. The cold glance Robert gave Liam after he began spending more time with Edward. And then, the phone call. It happened late one night, nearly 1 a.m. Edward had gone downstairs for a glass of water. As he passed the den, he heard the low murmur of Robert's voice. The door was mostly shut, but a sliver of light and sound escaped. Edward paused. The voice on the other end was muted, indistinct, but Robert's words were crisp with tension. No, he doesn't suspect anything. He thinks he's still just a guest. No. Helen's too close to slipping up. She's getting emotional about it. A pause. A sigh. I told her we needed to keep him calm until the papers are done. Once it's in her name, we can. The floorboard beneath Edward creaked. The room fell silent. The call ended in an instant. The door swung open. They stood there. Robert in the doorway, Edward in the hall. Neither said a word. Robert forced a polite smile, one that never reached his eyes. Couldn't sleep? Edward stared. You could say that. I was just handling something for work, Robert said too casually. Time zones, you know. Clients in Europe. Edward didn't respond. He turned and walked away, but the cold behind his ribs spread wider than it had before. That wasn't a work call. That was strategy. The next morning, Edward confronted Liam. I think Robert knows more than he lets on, Edward said over toast and bitter coffee. Liam didn't even blink. I've been thinking the same thing. What have you seen? Liam hesitated. Last week, I found something odd on his tablet. He left it open while he was in the garage. There were email drafts. One of them was to a lawyer about property transfers, and the way he talks to Mom when they think no one's listening. Edward leaned forward. He talks down to her, Liam continued, but in this weird, calculating way, like he's always reminding her how much she owes him. Edward's face darkened. He's known about the adoption, about the deed, about everything. Liam nodded slowly. I think he's been pushing her to get full control, maybe even threatening to leave her if she doesn't. It all began to fit together. Robert's neutrality wasn't indifference, it was camouflage. While Edward paid the bills and Helen played dutiful daughter, Robert had been the silent puppeteer, slowly tightening strings behind closed doors. And Helen, whether too desperate to be loved, too afraid to lose control, or too deeply wounded by her origins, had let herself be manipulated. Later that week, Edward got the final confirmation. He was out on the back porch, reading through the adoption papers again when the voices floated through the open kitchen window. Helen. He's digging, Robert. Liam too. They found the letters. Robert. Then burn them, before he finds the will. Helen. What if he already has? Robert. Then we need to speed this up. You get that house in your name. Now. You said June left it all to you. Convince him she wanted that. Say she changed her mind before she died. Helen. I can't lie to him again. Robert's voice colder than Edward had ever heard it. You already have. Edward lowered the papers in his hand. His heart thudded. Not from pain this time, but from clarity. The silence had broken, and in the echo he heard what had been hidden all along. This wasn't just about ungratefulness. It was conspiracy. He stood, his face like stone, and walked back inside, not to confront them yet, but to prepare. Because now he knew the truth. Helen might have spoken the cruel words, but Robert had whispered them into her ear. It was strange how grief lingered in the smallest places. The attic still smelled faintly of lavender, June's scent, faint but clinging to the old air like a final whisper. Edward hadn't come up here since the funeral, almost 3 years earlier. He had never needed to. Her things had remained untouched, preserved like a shrine. Neatly folded clothes, yellowing notebooks, dusty knitting baskets, half full of projects never finished. Now, armed with everything he and Liam had uncovered, Helen's adoption, Robert's quiet manipulation, the ledger proving his ownership, Edward was hunting for one last missing piece. June's will, not the one filed through the family lawyer. That one, Edward had seen after her death. Simple, almost too simple. It mentioned a few heirlooms, the joint account, and a vague reference to, quote, ongoing family support. Nothing specific about the house. Nothing about Helen. Nothing about James. But June had always been meticulous. She kept duplicates of everything, always in different locations. Edward remembered once joking that she should have worked for the CIA, not as a schoolteacher. She just smiled her soft, secretive smile. Some truths need to be protected from the people they might hurt, she'd said. Now Edward understood what she meant. Liam helped him shift boxes, setting aside old photo albums and yellowed recipe cards until they found it, a mahogany box, locked, with JM carved into the top. Edward's hands trembled as he retrieved the small brass key from his own keyring. He hadn't remembered what it was for until this moment. The lid opened with a soft click. Inside, a single sealed envelope with brittle edges and a wax stamp. It was addressed in June's careful handwriting, to be read in the event of my passing, by Edward. He opened it, heart pounding. The letter inside wasn't long, but every word hit like a thunderclap. Dearest Edward, if you're reading this, then the time has come for the truth to breathe. I never wanted this to be a secret, but I also didn't know how to tell you while we were alive. I hoped life would untangle it all on its own, but life is rarely that kind. Helen was not born to me. You already know this by now, or you soon will. What you may not know is that she had a brother. His name is James. He was taken from his mother at birth and placed into the system, while Helen was brought to us later by a quiet agreement with the biological parents. They wished to separate the siblings, fearing scandal. I tracked James down as a teenager, but by then he had changed his name and vanished again. I always intended to find him before my time ended. I failed, so I amended my original will. There is a second copy, filed quietly with an attorney named Evelyn Hart. In it, the ownership of our home is split equally between you and James. I left Helen out for a reason. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I had begun to see things in her, resentment, possessiveness, a growing distance. I feared what she might become if given unchecked control. If this letter finds you, go to Evelyn. She knows what to do. I love you, and I'm sorry. June. Edward sat in stunned silence. The old grief of her passing now mingled with fresh sorrow and revelation. She had known. All along. The woman he thought had kept quiet out of trust had actually carried a storm she was too afraid to unleash. James? He was real? A brother Helen never knew, or worse, knew about but never acknowledged. A rightful heir. Edward looked up at Liam, who had been silently reading over his shoulder. She left it all to you and James? Liam asked softly. Not me, Edward said. Me and him. She wanted the house to go to both of us. But the lawyer, the one we saw after her death, she showed us the safe will, the one June prepared for public eyes. The real one was buried. Edward stood slowly, folding the letter with care. We have to find this lawyer, Evelyn Hart. Liam's voice was tight with emotion. What happens when we find James? Edward looked at his grandson, this quiet, loyal soul who had opened the door to everything, and felt something unshakable settle inside him. We invite him home, Edward said. And we finish what June couldn't. The journey to find James was not straightforward. Liam had always been resourceful, but tracking down a man who had deliberately vanished decades ago proved far more difficult than either of them anticipated. June's letter gave them one critical detail. James had changed his name. No birth certificate, no adoption records that led anywhere. Just a boy swallowed by the system, and a paper trail so faint it might as well have been smoke. But Edward was determined, not out of revenge anymore. He had passed through that fire. Now it was duty, legacy, closure, and then, finally, a breakthrough. After 3 weeks of dead ends and whispered phone calls, Liam stumbled upon a name, Matthew Cross, attached to an old foster record with a birthday that matched James's. The name was tied to a small town just 2 hours away. He was listed as a carpenter, unmarried, no criminal record, no known family. It was him. Edward didn't hesitate. He and Liam drove there on a warm Friday morning, nerves brittle in the silence between them. Edward's hands trembled as they gripped the steering wheel, the weight of history pressing on his chest like an anchor. They found James, or Matthew, in a modest workshop tucked behind an auto garage, surrounded by half-finished chairs and the scent of cedar. He was lean, with streaks of gray in his hair, and a face lined with quiet labor. When he looked up and saw them, there was no recognition, only polite confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Edward stepped forward, his voice tight. "I think you knew my wife, June Mallory." The name landed with a pause. James's eyes narrowed slightly. "I knew of her. I got a letter from her once. Years ago. Never wrote back." Liam watched the exchange, holding his breath. "I'm Edward," Edward said. "I'm her husband. You're her son." James didn't react. Not the way Edward expected. No disbelief. No denial. Just a long, slow breath as he sank onto a nearby stool. "I always wondered if that letter meant something," he muttered. Didn't expect it to show up in person 20 years later. "You have a sister," Liam said carefully. "Helen." That name sparked something. James scoffed. Almost laughed, bitterly. "Oh, I know about Helen," he said. "Our adoptive parents didn't tell us much, but I figured it out eventually. We were separated. She went to a nice home. I didn't." He leaned forward. "So what is this? A reunion? A guilt trip?" Edward shook his head. "No, it's unfinished business. My wife left a will. The real one. She named you as the rightful heir to the house. Half of it belongs to you." James blinked. "Excuse me?" Edward handed him the copy of the letter. He read it slowly, then again. His face darkened with disbelief and something else. Hurt, maybe, or suspicion hardened over years of abandonment. "I don't understand," James said at last. "Why now?" "Because the people who've been living in that house, Helen and her husband, have been trying to erase what June wanted. What you were owed. We only found the truth weeks ago," Edward explained. "Now we need to set it right." There was a long silence. James stared at the letter, then at Edward. "You think I'm just going to show up and be part of this picture-perfect correction?" he asked. "That I want anything from people who threw me away?" Liam spoke gently. "You're not a mistake, James. You were hidden, kept apart, and it wasn't right. But that house, that legacy, it's part of your story too. You get to choose what to do with it." For a long time, James said nothing. He stared at his workbench. The smell of wood hung heavy in the air. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll come," he said. "Not for the house, for the truth." 2 days later, James walked into the house where Helen had lived for over 20 years. The moment was surreal. Edward watched her freeze at the top of the stairs, wineglass in hand, as James stepped through the door. Her eyes widened. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. He didn't say anything at first, just stared. Helen's voice was barely a whisper. You. James's smile was thin. Nice to see you too, sister. And in that instant, Edward saw something crack in Helen. Not just shock, but fear. James wasn't here to ask for forgiveness. He was here to remind her that the past she'd buried was very much alive. And far from over. The house felt colder than usual, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Maybe it was the silence, so thick it was almost physical. As Helen sat on the edge of the living room sofa, her back rigid, hands clamped in her lap. Across from her, James leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, his eyes unblinking. Edward stood by the window, while Liam lingered near the hall, barely breathing. The confrontation had been inevitable since James walked in. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about the lies, the kind that festered for years in quiet glances, unspoken words, and uneasy truths avoided at all costs. Helen broke first. "You should have stayed gone," she said, voice low and bitter. "You didn't belong then, and you don't belong now." James didn't flinch. "I didn't choose to be gone. You think I vanished on purpose. You were adopted into a warm home. I went through 4 different foster placements before I was 16. I slept on floors, Helen. You slept on silk sheets." Helen gave a dry laugh, eyes flicking to Edward. "Warm home? Are you kidding me? I spent my life playing second to a ghost, June's real child, the one she never forgot. I always knew." That caught Edward off guard. "You knew?" She turned to him, eyes hard. "Of course I knew. You think I never figured it out?" You and Mom whispered behind closed doors. "I found her letters once, hidden in her drawer. I saw James's name." She looked at James now, her voice growing sharper. "You were always the real one. The one she never stopped looking for. And me? I was a placeholder. Something to make her feel better about her choices. I was adopted to patch a wound she never let heal." Edward's voice shook. "Helen, we loved you." "No, you tolerated me," she snapped. "You put a roof over my head, but it was never mine." I saw the way she looked at me when I misbehaved, like she was afraid I'd turn out like someone else. And you? You paid the bills and stayed silent. You never stood up for me." James stepped forward. "So you spent your whole life punishing people who tried to care for you?" "I protected what I thought was mine," she exploded. "This house, this family, was all I had. And then you show up. You and Edward and your precious papers and your pity, like I'm the villain in your story." Edward's voice, for the first time, was steely. "No one made you manipulate me, Helen. No one made you mock me behind my back while I was paying your mortgage. That was your choice." Helen rose from the sofa. Her face was pale, but her anger burned hot. "Do you know what it's like," she said tightly, "to live every day knowing you're second best? That everything you have, your name, your home, your identity, is borrowed? That at any moment, it could all be taken away if the truth ever came out?" She turned to James, her expression unreadable. "I hated you before I ever met you. Because you were always the one thing I could never be. Real." For a moment no one spoke. Then James, voice calm and clear, said, "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't come to take something from you. I came because someone, our mother, wanted me to be part of this family. You could have had that too. But you made your choice." Helen's lip quivered, but she turned away. "You don't know what I've had to do to hold on to this place, what I've sacrificed." Edward stepped forward. "You've sacrificed nothing. You took my silence for weakness. You took advantage of my loyalty. And now you're losing the very thing you tried to steal." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Edward looked directly at her. "The house is no longer yours to claim." "What?" He nodded toward Liam. The young man opened a folder and set it on the coffee table. Signed paperwork, notarized and final. Edward said quietly, "The deed is being transferred to James and Liam. They're the rightful heirs now." Helen's breath caught. Her world, built on secrets and scaffolds of resentment, had finally collapsed. You can't do this," she whispered. "This was mine. Everything I did for this." Edward didn't waver. "And now you'll live with what you've done." As Helen sank back down into the sofa, stunned and hollow, James turned away. Not out of cruelty, but because he had nothing more to say. And Edward? He finally felt the weight lift. Not the sorrow. That would always linger. But the burden of loyalty unreturned. That was gone. The morning sun rose slowly, casting long shadows through the kitchen windows, sunlight pouring in as if it, too, wanted to witness the final act of a story decades in the making. Edward sat at the table, hands folded, a cup of tea growing cold in front of him. Across the room, Liam and James stood side by side, both silent, both watching him with a kind of reverence and tension. The air was charged, not with confrontation, but with quiet anticipation. Helen had left the house the night before. No tearful goodbyes, no final pleas. Just the slam of a door and the echo of her footsteps fading down the walkway. Whether she'd return to fight or disappear into the silence she'd created was no longer Edward's concern. He had already made his choice. "You're sure about this?" Liam asked gently, placing the freshly signed deed on the table. Edward's signature sat beside James's and Liam's, the ink barely dry. "You could keep your name on it. As a safeguard." Edward shook his head. "No. It needs to end with me," he said softly. "Too many pieces of my life were given in quiet, hoping they'd be appreciated. This." He nodded toward the deed. "This is the one thing I'm giving by choice." James leaned forward. "You're not being pushed out, Edward. You're family." "I know that now," Edward replied. "But I also know what it means to hold on to something too long, hoping it'll finally feel like it should have from the start. It's time to let it go. The house never loved me back. It's just wood and stone. You two? You're what matters now." Liam's eyes stung, but he nodded, understanding. It wasn't just a transfer of property. It was the final act of freedom. Edward was releasing not just a house, but a weight that had lived on his shoulders for years. Loyalty to a daughter who had only seen him as a wallet, a ghost of a wife whose final wishes had been buried, and a history that had nearly drowned him in silence. Later that afternoon, the three of them stood on the front porch. The wind was light. A storm threatened on the horizon, distant but inevitable. Helen returned around 3 o'clock. She stood at the end of the driveway, face pale and unreadable, dressed simply, no luggage in hand. Just her, and a long, defeated silence. Edward walked to meet her halfway. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was nothing but time between them. "You gave it to them," she said flatly. Edward nodded. "Yes." She looked away. "So that's it. You cut me out completely." "I gave you every chance to show me something real, Helen," he replied, his voice low but firm. "Respect. Gratitude. Even honesty. You gave me none of those." Her voice cracked. "It wasn't supposed to go like this." "No," he said. "But you made your choices. And I made mine." She stepped back, biting her lip. The weight of consequences finally settling around her shoulders. Her world, built on control, manipulation, and fear, had no foundation left. And Edward? He turned and walked back toward the house, not angrily, not triumphantly, but with peace. With every step, the burden he'd carried for decades seemed to shed from his bones. He stopped at the porch beside James and Liam. "You'll take care of it?" he asked. James nodded. "We will. And you'll always have a place here if you want it." Edward smiled. Tired, but warm. "No." I think it's time I found somewhere that's mine. Something I choose for me. Liam stepped forward. Where will you go? I don't know yet, Edward said, but for the first time in a long time, I don't feel lost. They watched him walk down the street, the sun casting his shadow long behind him. Not an exile, not a victim, but a man reclaiming himself. As he disappeared from view, Liam turned to James. He deserved better. James nodded. Now he gets it, in his own way. Behind them, the house stood still, no longer haunted by secrets. It had changed hands, but more than that, it had changed hearts. And in that final twist, it wasn't just property that was passed down. It was dignity, truth, and the start of a better legacy.